Most people recognize the name Devil's Brigade. They picture the 1968 film, William Holden, and a unit of rowdy American criminals and stiff Canadian soldiers who brawl their way into becoming elite commandos. It makes for a good story, but it gets the fundamental lesson exactly backwards. The men of the 1st Special Service Force weren't criminals plucked from stockades. They were, for the most part, already experts in the harshest environments North America had to offer: lumberjacks, forest rangers, trappers, miners, and explorers. The misconception matters because it obscures the real, uncomfortable truth about elite unit formation. The force wasn't built by taking broken men and disciplining them. It was built by taking self-reliant men and teaching them to cooperate. The Hollywood version suggests you can manufacture toughness through punishment. The reality of the FSSF proves that toughness is a raw material you have to import. The discipline they learned wasn't about obeying orders, it was about coordinating survival. And when you strip away the legend of the Devil's Brigade, what you find is a 2-year experiment in extreme cooperation that became the blueprint for every special operations unit that followed, not because of their heroism, but because of how they were selected, how they were equipped, and how they were ultimately discarded. The plan was so insane, the man put in charge of it argued against it until they put him in charge of it. To understand the 1st Special Service Force, you have to understand that it was born from a British plan called Project Plough, which was exactly as risky as it sounds. The idea was to parachute commandos into the Norwegian mountains to harass the German occupiers and destroy hydroelectric facilities. The problem was the logistics. When the proposal landed on the desk of a young staff officer named Robert T. Frederick, he did what good staff officers do. He wrote a memo explaining why it was a terrible idea. He pointed out that the objectives were unrealistic for a small force, that there was no feasible extraction plan, and that the whole thing would likely end in the annihilation of the unit. His superiors read his objections, agreed with his analysis, and promptly put him in charge of making it work. Frederick was 35 years old. He was given a collection of raw volunteers from the United States and Canada, a patch of wilderness in Montana, and a mandate to create a unit capable of operating in terrain where conventional armies couldn't function. The Hollywood version of this is the stern commander whipping men into shape. The reality is that Frederick looked at his men, saw they were already woodsmen and hunters, and designed a training program that amplified what they could already do, rather than trying to erase their civilian identities. They trained to kill, but they spent most of their energy learning to move. The curriculum at Fort Harrison in Helena, Montana, is often described as grueling, which is, a polite way of saying it was designed to break anyone who could be broken. They learned to jump out of airplanes on their 2nd day. They marched 100 miles. They learned to ski until they moved as well as the Norwegian instructors who were brought in to teach them. But the overlooked core of their training wasn't violence. It was movement. They didn't just practice climbing, they practiced climbing at night in full kit, up rock faces that, honestly, experienced mountaineers would hesitate on. They didn't just practice skiing, they practiced navigating with a compass through whiteout conditions where the only thing separating them from a frozen death was the man next to them. The goal was to make the environment their ally, not their enemy. This is the part of the story that survivalists need to pay attention to. The FSSF understood that in mountain warfare, the guy who can move faster and with less noise will always win against the guy with the bigger gun. Their physical fitness wasn't for show, it was a tactical weapon. When they finally got to Italy, they were assigned to take a mountain called Monte la Difensa, which had stalled the Allied advance for weeks. The German defenders, the 104th Panzer Gschr Enter Scharnadientij Jo Redidauer Ansur Sham Perpanjaman, Amandimanaran held the obvious approaches, so the force did what they were trained to do. They looked at the terrain, found the place where movement was theoretically impossible, a 1,000-foot cliff on the German flank, and they climbed it at night in the freezing rain. They won the battle with their legs, and the psychological war with a sticker. The assault on Monte la Defensa took about 2 hours. The Germans, dug in with machine guns and artillery, were looking downhill at the roads and trails where they expected an attack. They weren't looking up at the ridgeline where 1,000 men were pulling themselves over the edge with frozen hands. This is the part of the story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The force achieved surprise, not through stealth, but through audacity. The Germans knew a cliff was there. They just assumed no one would be stupid enough to try it. The force proved them wrong, and in doing so, demonstrated a principle that would become central to special operations doctrine. If you can do what your enemy considers impossible, you have already won half the battle before a shot is fired. But it was at the Anzio beachhead where the force truly earned their nickname. Pinned down with the rest of the Allied force, outnumbered and facing some of Germany's best units, the FSSF began conducting nightly patrols behind enemy lines. They blackened their faces with shoe polish, moved with absolute silence, and killed with knives to avoid alerting the wider German positions. Then, before melting back into the night, they would leave their unit sticker on the bodies, a red spearhead with the words Das dicke Ende kommt noch, which means the worst is yet to come. The Germans began calling them the Schwarzer Teufel, the Black Devils. An intelligence report captured from a German prisoner warned that they were, and I quote, treacherous, unmerciful, and clever. You cannot afford to relax. That reputation, that psychological weight, was worth another division of infantry. It meant that German units opposite the force had to stay awake all night, every night, waiting for an enemy they couldn't hear or see. The thing that broke them wasn't the Germans, it was the paperwork. For all their combat success, the 1st Special Service Force was eventually undone by the very thing that made them unique, their binational status. The administrative friction was immense. American and Canadian soldiers served in the same platoons, ate the same food, and bled the same blood, but they were paid differently. A Canadian sergeant earned the same as an American private, a fact that caused predictable resentment. Colonel Frederick had to get creative, arranging for the Canadians to be paid on different days than the Americans just to keep the peace. When it came time for decorations, the bureaucracy ground to a halt. Americans couldn't accept Canadian awards during the Second World War, and Canadians were initially denied American medals. These are the kinds of details that get left out of the patriotic documentaries, but they are essential for understanding why the force was disbanded in December 1944, even as their reputation was at its peak. The war in Europe was entering a new phase, with fast-moving armored columns replacing the static mountain fighting where the force excelled. But more than that, the political will to maintain a joint unit with separate pay scales, separate supply chains, and separate chains of command had simply evaporated. The men who had climbed Monte la Defensa were split up, the Canadians sent to their own parachute battalions, the Americans absorbed into other airborne units or the new 474th Infantry Regiment. It was an administrative decision, clean and bloodless on paper, but it ended one of the most effective fighting forces in American military history. The 1st Special Service Force existed for just over 2 years. In that time they suffered an attrition rate of over 600%, meaning the unit was effectively wiped out and rebuilt multiple times over. They are credited with capturing or killing nearly 30,000 German troops. A staggering number for a unit that never fielded more than 2,000 men at once. But their real legacy isn't the body count, it's the DNA they passed on. Every modern special operator, whether in the Green Berets, the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, or even the Navy SEALs, carries a piece of the force with them. It's in the emphasis on small unit autonomy. It's in the belief that a man who can navigate a mountain in a blizzard is worth 10 men who can only shoot straight on a range. And it's in the quiet understanding that the mission comes first, not because of blind patriotism, but because the man next to you is counting on you to do your job. The Devil's Brigade wasn't a collection of misfits who learned to fight. They were a collection of survivors who learned to trust each other. That's a distinction worth remembering. If you value in-depth historical analysis that goes beyond the surface-level summaries, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the hardest battles are often fought against the terrain, the bureaucracy, and the limits of human endurance. This is War Machiner, reminding you that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does instruct.